Well, good Monday morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me for today's devotion. We are in 1 Corinthians 14. And let me also say, for those of you who use this bookmark to keep up with the reading plan, it runs out the end of July. The new bookmark with the rest of the reading plan for the rest of this year are available at the church. And of course, as always, the full reading plan is on our website and social media platforms. So I just want to make you aware of that. In this chapter, I think to help you understand it, I want to point out that there are two underlying principles which Paul uses in teaching here, and they describe these principles that underline what he's saying, but also that underlie what God expects or looks for when we as believers worship. One of those is the principle of edification of the congregation, non-individualistic self-promotion or individual ecstasy. Sort of like when we last week talked about the spiritual gifts, that they are for the building up or edification, the benefit of the whole body, not just for personal edification. The second underlying principle when it comes to worship is order, not chaos. And those two principles of edification of the whole body and order instead of chaos showed up in the Corinthian church, as Paul describes it in this chapter, in two areas. One was how they were exercising the gift of tongues, and the other was this tendency to interrupt those who were prophesying or preaching with questions and talking back and forth to one another about what was being said. There was just mass chaos in the public worship services at Corinth, apparently. Tongues, let's look at edification, because tongues was the issue there. Tongues have become more about self-glorification, self-adulation, than edification of the body. And they were all, or not all, but many of them were speaking in tongues at the same time, and nobody was interpreting. It sounded like gibberish. So it was just mass chaos listening to all the noise at one time, especially if somebody who was lost and unchurched, not a follower of Jesus, came in and said, it would just sound like a lot of noise. And so he talks about that. And in this chapter, he makes the point that prophecy and preaching are done in a language that everybody there understands, because it's done in their language, whereas tongues is a language that the people there do not understand. So look at verse 4 of chapter 14. And by the way, we're going to be a little bit longer today because I'm going to do some teaching through this chapter. Verse 4, he says, "The one who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but the one who prophesies edifies the church," the body. Verse 5, "Now I wish that you all spoke in tongues, but even more that you would prophesy. And greater is one who prophesies than one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets." There's someone to interpret into the language of the people what the person who spoke in tongues actually said. He says, so that the church may receive edifying. In other words, what happens in public corporate worship is to focus on edification of the body, not just one person having their time with God. It's the whole body is to be encouraged and edified. Verse 10, if you drop down, or verse 9 rather, verse 9, he said, "So also you, unless you utter by the tongue speech that is clear, how will it be known what is spoken? For you will be speaking into the air." Again, the focus is on encouraging the body, everybody understanding. Verse 10, he says, "There are perhaps a great many kinds of languages in the world, and no kind is without meaning." There are, hundreds of languages on this planet, and they all mean something to the people who know that language. Verse 11, "If then I do not know the meaning of the language," so I've been to different countries in Africa. I go to Zambia and they speak their language, or I go to Kenya and I hear someone speaking Turkana. I don't understand what they're saying. And so he says, if I do not know the meaning in verse 11 of the language, I will be to the one who speaks a barbarian, and the one who speaks will be a barbarian to me. We won't understand each other. So you get the picture. Now, drop down to verses 22 and following, and let me help you understand the role of tongues. Not the way it's sometimes practiced in churches, but the way Paul, God's word tells us it's to be practiced. Verse 22. He says, so then, tongues are for a sign, not to those who believe, but to the unbelievers. Now listen to that. Slow down. We read God's word and don't see what's on the page. We read God's word too often, and it's like we gloss over what it actually says because we already have in our mind what it means, and we miss the actual words. Slow down. He says tongues is a sign not to those who are already saved, those who are believers, but to unbelievers, to the lost. Now get that. The purpose of tongues is not for the saved, but for the lost. Prophecy, not so much the unbelievers as those who believe. It has more use to those who already believe because it's teaching. Verse 23. Therefore, so because of this, if the whole church assembles, so it's Sunday morning and the whole church is together, and all speak in tongues, everybody's up talking in tongues, and an ungifted man or unbelievers, a lost person comes into your service, will they not say that you are mad, you're crazy, because what you're doing makes absolutely no sense to that lost, unchurched person? Verse 24. But if all prophesy, preaching, teaching, and an unbeliever, he comes in, he is convicted by all that he's hearing. And verse 25 speaks to his heart, and he falls on his face and he worships God, and he gets saved. He gets saved. Tongues in the Bible is an evangelistic gift. An evangelistic gift. Clearly here he says it's for those who are not yet believers. In the book of Acts on the day of Pentecost, everybody heard them speaking in their language because people had come to Jerusalem for that festival, that holiday, from different nations. Jews who lived in different nations speaking different languages came to Jerusalem, and they heard the apostles speaking in their own language. That was the exercise of tongues at Pentecost. It was an evangelistic gift, and thousands were saved as a result. And here Paul's saying essentially the same thing, that the purpose of tongues is not for those who are believers, it is for those who are lost. It's the ability to speak a language you don't naturally speak, so someone who's lost can hear it in their own heart language, in their native tongue. It's an evangelistic gift, brothers and sisters. And so because of that, he gives some guidelines for the exercise of it in worship services, starting at verse 27. He said, if anyone speaks in a tongue, it should be by two or at most three, and each in turn. I've been to churches where everybody's just talking in tongues out loud all at the same time. A contradiction to what he says here. No more than three persons speak in tongues in any worship service, and only one at a time. He adds at the end of verse 27, and one must interpret, so that everybody out there can understand exactly what is being said. And if there is no interpreter, he must keep silent in the church. It's pretty cut and dry. Now, the overarching principle is the one we talked about previously, the edification of the body, not individual ecstasy, because you're just having your time with God Worship is meaningful to me personally and to you personally, but corporate worship is to be about edifying the body as we glorify God together. It's not just about me or you. So there was confusion because everybody was speaking in tongues and nobody understood what was being said, and it was creating confusion, and it was actually working against the church being evangelistic. Now, the second issue, order versus chaos. And this one related to the women in the church especially. Chaos was in this church for many reasons. You think about the Lord's Supper, how they'd come and those who had a lot of food would pig out and even eat before people got to pig out and get drunk, and others didn't, they were chaos there. And then there was chaos in the worship with the way they did tongues, and apparently even in prophecy, you'd have people trying to preach over top of one another. Verse 29, he said, let 2 or 3 prophets speak and let others pass judgment. So they apparently had a custom of after somebody preached, then they would discuss it, evaluate the truth of what was preached, and so on. And be done in an orderly way. In verse 31, For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be exhorted. Whoever's gifted can do it, but just one at a time, guys, so that everybody can learn and everybody can be exhorted or edified or encouraged. Then he adds something interesting in verse 32. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. In other words, what that means is, as a prophet or a preacher, I have control over the spirit, over the gift. I have control over whether or not I talk. It's not I just go into some kind of trance and have no control. No, I have control over the exercise of that gift is his point. Just as he also said the same thing with people who have the gift of tongues. You have control over whether or not you use it. Choose to speak or choose not to speak. But if you're going to do it one at a time and do it the right way and orderly, verse 33, for God is not a God of confusion. God's not a God of confusion. And then he says these words to women that some people, I think, take out of context and misuse, verses 34 and 35. He says, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says, if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. For it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Now, some people have taken these verses and said, women are never, ever to speak in public worship. And yet, 3 chapters earlier in chapter 11, Paul makes it clear that women prayed and prophesied during the worship services. And you got to make those fit together. So he's not saying women can never speak in church. There's 2 leading interpretations of what is meant by this. The first one, and this is not mine, not the one I agree with, but it is a very common one, is that when they finished the prophecy, the preaching, and there was that time of Q&A, that women were to be quiet during that time and not ask questions, because to ask a question at that time would be like they were exercising some kind of headship over the man who had prophesied. That's not persuasive to me, because if women were prophesying, as they are mentioned doing in chapter 11, why would they not be able to take part in the Q&A? Just doesn't make sense to me. I think it has to do with the chaos. In their day, for the most part, women were much less educated. It was very common in the Greco-Roman world that women were viewed as property and not educated. And you think about the way women are treated in some parts, especially the Arab world today. Wasn't quite the same. I'm not saying that, but it was rare. Only women of the upper class were really educated in ancient times in the Greco-Roman world. And with all this chaos, because remember, their worship services were chaotic. So you've got all these people speaking in tongues at the same time. And so here's these people prophesying, and they're asking questions. They're not doing it one at a time. They're talking over each other. And these less educated women were probably asking a lot. They may turn to their husband there. Now, what does he mean by that? Or they might, and he just say, hey, stop interrupting. The context to understand all he says in this chapter is the very last verse of the chapter, verse 40. He said, all things must be done properly and in an orderly manner. Properly in a fitting or decent and orderly manner or way. What Paul was trying to do is say, your all's worship service is so chaotic. If a lost person comes in there, they won't make sense of it because everybody's talking at the same time. Stop it. Focus on doing it in an orderly way so that people can learn and people are encouraged, people are edified, lost people can make sense of it and get saved. That's what he's saying in this chapter. Well, you just got a 16-minute sermon. I hope you hung in there with me. I'll see you tomorrow.